year over a dozen marches glorifying Nazism and fascism take place all over Europe in a diligently planned and well-organized and in a very much predictable manner. These marches pervert the memory of the Holocaust. They are really a breeding ground for dangerous extremists, and they intimidate and silence marginalized communities. And so they are a clear and present threat to our society. In a European Union that very clearly and vocally disavows the anti-Semitic and totalitarian views of these Nazi and fascist gatherings, we felt strongly that we need a much more vigorous push to curtail them. And so we produced this report hoping to make this push happen. We'll be having a discussion about the ins and outs of the report with Simon Rafael, who is the editor-in-chief of Bell Tower News at the Amadeu Antonio Foundation and the author of many of the entries you will find in the report, and with Johanan Seinave, who edited the report and also authored 2 of its entries. Johanan has stepped in last minute as the author of our legal analysis. Dr. Alexandra Grabias has fallen very sick, so we're very grateful to Johanan for coming in. Really grateful that you could join us. Alongside Simon, Johanan, and Dr. Grabias, 8 additional authors who are experts in the field have contributed entries to the report, and I really wanted to give them a shout out right at the start. Dr. Valerio Alfonso Bruno, Mike Fielitz, Bini Gutmann, Linus Puck, Nicholas Potter, Lara Schulz, Dr. Ulla Silvonianen, and Grisha Staniek. Big thank you and big shout out to you all. And I'll also note that the report was put together with the support of the German Federal Foreign Office, and obviously we are extremely grateful for that as well. So, why this report and why now? During the pandemic, there was a lot of speculation within the sort of expert community following far-right extremist movements about what would happen with these demonstrations after the pandemic. Will they die out? Will they re-emerge? Will they sort of mutate into something new? And in February, we got a bit of that answer. We've seen 4 of the 12 marches documented in this report actually taking place. We've seen neo-Nazis gather in Budapest, in Sofia, in Dresden, and in Madrid. We expect, sadly, that the rest of the marches in our report will also take place. And that's precisely why we wrote this report. The cases documented here happen and have been happening every year, sometimes for decades. They are not sort of ad hoc demonstrations in the wake of current events. They are meticulous, well-planned, and as I said previously, predictable events. Anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial and distortion, against which legislation exists in many European countries, are everywhere at these marches. Nazi and fascist symbols, illegal ones, are present everywhere. Chants of illegal hate speech are also omnipresent. Racial incitement is everywhere. Organizers often hold criminal records. And what, in my opinion, is perhaps the most baffling, these marches happen despite existing legislation that would seem to say they should not exist, and often despite explicit bans. So in a moment of great polarization, where far-right parties in Europe have gained a lot of momentum, these staples on the far-right calendar, with near universal name recognition within the extreme right, are at the heart of what seems to be an emerging far-right culture of remembrance that is looking to retell history. And that's something we cannot let happen, so we went looking for answers. Simon here will give us a deep dive into the report, and especially what we've seen at the marches themselves. Johanan will give us an overview of the legal analysis, which at times can be quite stuffy and complicated to grasp, so thank you for taking that on. We'll look at the legal tools that exist and how they're being used or not used. And then we'll have a short discussion about recommendations. So Simone, without further ado, I'm handing over to you.
Yeah, perfect, Alina. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm also very happy to be here and to be in such a good partnership on this very important topic, which we think is very important as well. I work for the Amadeu Antonio Foundation. We are working in Germany, based in Berlin, but working all over the country with the aim to strengthen civil society, so civil society actions against far-right extremism. So this is my perspective looking at these marches. I'm a journalist and researcher at our journalistic website, Bell Tower News, and I was very happy to find a lot of journalistic and academia partners to describe these marches, because one very interesting thing is that you can see that the far-right scene is organized quite well in an international or at least in a European range. While the people who are working against these groups, the civil society organizations or also journalists or academia, are not always so good connected as as the fascists are. So this is really the first report describing all these marches, even though we found that there are a lot of similarities and people coming to these marches together. So it's very important to have this European look. What is happening on the marches. So I'm very happy that we can do this now. So we have reports on these marches in every country and in the home languages, but this is the first one where we tried to bring everything together to have a look what conclusions we can take from this. So what did we find? As you can imagine by the name of the report, the marches glorifying Nazism and fascism are an organized pan-European phenomenon we see in a lot of countries. As Alina already said, we looked at 12 of the most notorious annual gatherings, the biggest ones and the most violent ones all over Europe. And we could find that 10 out of these 12 marches have something in common. Because they are directly dedicated, partially or fully, to the glorification of Nazi war criminals and their collaborators in these countries where the marches take place. So we have from the very beginning a very strong part leading to revisionism and trying to build a common European far-right identity. I will come back to this later. And we can say that these marches also cling to a special part of the far-right scene in Europe. And this is the action-orientated, to put it like this. So these are not the people who are interested in political discourse and going to parliaments and change things from there, but these are really far-right extremists who want to act out their ideology in violence and acting against democracy in general. So this is something which brings them all together. And as Alina already mentioned, one of the findings we had is that anti-Semitism is really a core element at these marches. It occurs in a lot of different versions, made through a display of explicit banners, for example, on the marches, through slogans which are shouted on the marches. They can be very explicit, like all Jews should go out, but also very hinted, like dog whistles or veiled references everywhere. This would be not legal to be this explicit. We see overt incitements by speakers on the marches. We see shows of force in front of Jewish communal buildings or Holocaust memorial sites through demonstrators. And so there are a lot of things. You can see other marches. One thing which is perhaps even more important, because during the pandemic it spread all over society, are conspiracy narrations with an anti-Semitic notion. We can also see at these marches as well. For example, that Jews are portrayed as globalists or puppeteers behind governments, having their own plan with humanhood, which can, for example, mean that people believe, far-right people believe in the Great Replacement theories, that, for example, Jews are responsible for replacing Europeans with Muslims or African people, which should be easier to govern, for example, or a narration which is also quite long ongoing in the far-right scene, that, for example, World War II was a fractional war, a war between brothers or cultures who should be together. and a common enemy, which is made out of this, are Jews who brought these brothers to fight each other. So these are really, really strong hints that anti-Semitism is a core moment in the in the marches. We can also see, as I said, that these marches try to rehabilitate. Oh God, I don't get the word. They try to show that war criminals, Nazi war criminals, and their collaborators are something they want to cling to in a positive manner. They try to rehabilitate them and try to just glorify them on the streets. These are really very often anti-Semitic historical figures as Benito Mussolini or Rudolf Hess or Ante Pawelczyk or 𝐸𝐴 Lukov, so really very open Nazis or Nazi collaborators, and Adolf Hitler himself as well. They do so because they want to create a common narration of a far-right scene in Europe. Of course, in every country, the far-right scene is not so strong as they wished to appear. So they need these marches where they come together, and these are marches where always not only the neo-Nazis or far-rights from one country go on the streets, but they invite each other and come together on the marches to have the stronger appearance from themselves, and of course also because it's a moment to organize themselves in a European manner. So we see really the people who are coming together to these marches regularly are really the ones you don't want to have in your inner cities or in your foreyards, because these are really the most explicit and most criminal neo-Nazis and far-rights, especially, for example, from the music scene networks like Blood and Honor or Combat 18, their terrorist arm, for example, which is one of the first international far-right scenes which always organize themselves at the marches as well. We can see fighters from mixed martial arts clubs where you have far-right events organized during the marches, for example, or after the marches, which is just happening now in Budapest, for example. You have football hooligans on these marches who are also very keen to be violent. And of course, you have terrorist organizations such as National Action, for example, from Great Britain, the Russian Imperial Movement, or the Nordic Resistance Movement, or biker-like organizations like the Soldiers of Odin. So these are really the worst people you could imagine. And for example, from Germany, where I come from, for example, the Blood and Honor networks, the musical networks are banned. But you have, of course, organizations like small parties like Die Rechte and der Dritte Weg, who just are catch-all organizations for these structures. So these are the people who are present at the marches in Europe as well. And last but not least, we have to say that these marches, of course, are a problem for people who are vulnerable groups for attacks by neo-Nazis. They're intimidated by the mere presence of these marches because this is for vulnerable groups a sign that the state authorities obviously do at least are not on their sides. In the worst case, are on the sides of far-right movements trying to glorify Nazism on the streets, which of course is a very chilling effect for democratic societies to act against this. And if we see, for example, that counter protesters sometimes by state authorities are claimed to be the real problem and bringing trouble, while the neo-Nazi demonstrations are so orderly, which of course is a tactic to not be banned. So this is, of course, a problem if victim groups, for example, are portrayed as over-central if they ask for more protection, if these marches take place in front of synagogues or mosques, for example. So overall, we can say that these marches always attract the same group of people who organize themselves as a terrorist network all over Europe. So they are really spreading anti-Semitism and Holocaust distortion on these marches on a very high degree, and it's very difficult to understand if we have legislations against it, why we are not using them, and perhaps this is an elegant way to hand over to you, Jonan.
Thank you, Simone. So I'm Johanan Seinave, I'm the editor of the report. I'm stepping in for our legal analysis writer, Dr. Alexandra Gliszczyńska-Grabias. And in our analysis, we conducted an overview of European, meaning Pan-European, Council of Europe, as well as European Union and relevant national legislation. So what kinds of behaviors have legal consequences in the marches glorifying Nazism and fascism? So this can be, as Simone mentioned, glorification of war crimes and criminals. So when honor is openly paid to Ante Pavelic in Bleiburg in Austria, or to Hristo Lukov in Bulgaria, display of totalitarian symbols. So for example, when both Nazi or fascist symbols are on sale in Predapio in Italy, Holocaust denial, and in a more limited manner, Holocaust distortion, which is, as Simone mentioned, ubiquitous at the marches. There is no march where there is no Holocaust denial or distortion. Incitement to hatred or discrimination, just to give you one example of Madrid, when a speaker very openly said, the Jews are guilty, they are behind all of Europe's problems. This is anti-Semitic incitement. Symbolic acts of expression have also legal consequences. So for example, when in the Polish march, demonstrators burned a copy of the Edict of Kalisz, which granted Jews the right to live in Poland in Middle Age. So these all can have legal consequences. So the problem of the marches is that the concurrence of rights and freedoms of different people. So of course, people demonstrating have the freedom of expression, they have the freedom of assembly, but these rights are confronted with, of course, the rights of other people that are being discriminated or suffer from the consequences of these marches. So the key question at hand for a legal analysis is, can the freedom of those demonstrated be restricted according to our European legal frameworks? And the short answer is yes. The long answer, of course, requires getting a bit into two concepts. One is, of course, militant democracy. And this I will read out. It's a set of policies meant to restrict certain freedoms when exercised by anti-democratic forces, such as those organizing or attending Nazi marches. They are, for instance, banned in certain countries they are behind bans on Nazi parties or Nazi symbols, most notably in Germany, but they are in place in different forms across Europe. The other relevant concept is memory laws, which is laws that impose limits and restrictions on certain readings of history or state-approved interpretations of events. Notable example is, of course, bans on Holocaust denial, again very common across Europe, and to a lesser extent bans on Holocaust distortion. So we know from the reading of the European Convention on Human Rights that restrictions on freedom of association and freedom of expression are possible, as long as these restrictions are necessary in a democratic society and for the protection of the rights of others. Another important provision in this legal analysis is the prohibition of abuse of rights. This forbids states, but also groups of individuals, from relying on the protection of the convention to undermine the very essence of the rights. So this particular provision can be read as a legal translation of militant democracy doctrine. Of course, because as a rule, such restrictions have to be very limited and absolutely essential given the required context. Prohibition of abuse of rights has been only applied in the context of calls to hatred and incitement in the case law, particularly public expressions of Holocaust denial. As the report shows, application of Article 17, so prohibition of abuse of rights, restricting the rights of others, for the sake of the defense of the democratic order is justified. So the next thing that the report did is looked at relevant case law to understand how these concepts are applied. Now the report includes around 20 cases, not only from the European Court of Human Rights, but also from its predecessor, the Human Rights Commission, as well as all the relevant judgments. I will only mention 5 of the most relevant to elucidate the concept. One case that you may have heard of is the Mbala versus France case concerning anti-Semitic comedian Dieudonné Mbala, who during one of his performances presented a Holocaust denier, Robert Faurisson, with an award. And when it then later invoked freedom of expression. So when the case came to be decided, the court ruled, and I'm reading again, that his performance, even if it was satirical because it was, in his words, comedy, was not protected by freedom of speech, but was in reality a demonstration of anti-Semitism and support for the Holocaust, and therefore ran counter to the values of the convention. This is one example, but the European Court of Human Rights in cases of Holocaust denial, have always taken this line consistently, that Holocaust deniers cannot invoke freedom of expression to promote Holocaust denial, as is the case in these marches. Regarding Nazi and fascist propaganda, the one case I'm going to name is the 𝐵𝐻 versus Austria, which very briefly involved Austrian members of a far-right party displaying Nazi symbols. Of course, the court said that Austria was right to ban these symbols as they were necessary in a democratic society. The fourth case, freedom of association, which is particularly relevant to the marches. It's very often certain organizations that are behind these marches. Is the Vona versus Hungary, and it relates to the now banned Magyar Garda, Hungarian far-right Guard Association, and its prohibition. The case, very briefly, depended on whether the fact that they had not made violent attempts to seize power were imminent was sufficient to ban the march for the organization. The court again banned that Hungary was allowed to take preventive measures to defend democracy as long as it was established that the movement was going to take concrete steps to undermine public life and the standards of the convention. As we believe that this is a situation that repeats itself among many of the organizers, restrictions on many of the organizers may have been opened by the Vona versus Hungary judgment. So one thing, those three cases I mentioned refer to the repressive, but then also want to address positive obligations of states to protect against hate crimes and hate speech, particularly in the context of Holocaust denial. So the 𝐵𝐻 v. 𝐵𝐻 case, which related anti-Semitic incitement by a far-right Bulgarian leader, Volen Sidorov of Ataka. The court ruled again that individuals, members of the Jewish community, were not necessarily required to have been attacked personally for their right to privacy and the prohibition of discrimination to apply. What this judgment, and this is the last judgment I'm including, opens to is for the potential victims of these marches to contest the lack of reaction of authorities in allowing these marches to ban. So this is as far as the Council of Europe legal framework will take us. Regarding the EU legal framework, I will mention that the framework decision on criminal law and combating certain forms of racism and xenophobia is the essential instrument, because it requires that certain forms of hate speech are criminal offenses, and these are punishable by effective, proportionate, and dissuasive penalties. This includes, for example, Holocaust denial and gross trivialization of the Holocaust. Now, the problem here is that the framework decision has not been yet fully transposed across the EU, and that this has resulted in significant gaps. Where the framework decision fully transposed, the question of positive obligations on member states to take action against these marches would be much clearer. So this is our first finding, that lack of transposition is a clear obstacle to taking action against these marches. Finally, very quickly on national legislation, independently of the European frameworks, a lot of member states have specific laws in place that would allow these marches to be banned. Just to name a few, in Italy, the Scelba-Mancino laws, in Austria, 𝐕𝐵𝐺, in Spain, the law of historical memory. All of these are in place, and they should have been followed. These marches should not be allowed to take place, which leads us to the main legal finding of the report, that basically across Europe, as far as it concerns all the 12 marches, proper legal instruments are in place to ban these marches. This is not only on the basis of national legislation, but on the basis of international treaties and European instruments in place in all the member states. We cannot leave it like that without saying that, of course, many member states have taken some efforts to some extent, counteract these marches. And we welcome and acknowledge these efforts. We acknowledge that they are also not easy to implement. restrictions of fundamental rights have to be applied very strictly. Particularly, as Simone mentioned, the criminal behaviors that occur at these marches are not always very explicit. And there are, of course, legal consequences in preemptively trying to ban a march that has not displayed any of the criminal behaviors I mentioned. In certain cases, and then this is the part we comment, such as in Finland, the marches have been elements that led to a ban of a criminal organization, such as the Nordic resistance movement. This is a positive step. So in Austria and in Spain, for example, state authorities have declared an intention to ban the marches. The bans have not occurred, but a declaration of intention is, of course, a first step. The other thing that we notice is that where bans have been put in place, such as Hungary or Bulgaria, the bans have not been implemented. As was mentioned before, Nazis were still able to march both in Sofia and in Budapest, in spite of bans being put in place. Finally, and the last point about the legal analysis is that whenever Holocaust denial complaints have been put to prosecutors, often they have been dismissed, often for rather incredible reasons. I'm going to give you an example from Madrid. The case of gross anti-Semitic incitement that I referred to before, when a speaker said the Jew is the enemy. A prosecutor in Madrid dismissed the case on the grounds, and I read, that laudable and miserable behaviors took place on both sides of World War II. This is a judgment by a court in Madrid, and it illustrates that a successful approach is in a certain way holistic. We need legislation in place, we need effort towards education, and of course, engagement from both authorities and the general public. And before we move to the recommendations, I would like to give the word to Alina.
Thank you so much for that to both of you, and maybe just to kind of try to flush out some of the main points so far. First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge we're dealing with a rather complex situation and a juxtaposition of the marches where we see these abhorrent behaviors, which are at times clearly illegal, put across what seem to be rather explicit legal obligations. Clearly there is a mismatch there. Something is not happening right when we see the law clear on one side and these behaviors in the marches still happening recurrently on the other side. Simone mentioned a set of very important findings. I think particularly striking are the elements around the sort of transnational connections between all these networks. Indeed, a lot of research often focuses on one march at a time or one national context at a time. But looking at all these together and seeing that interconnectedness, I think is extremely important and paints these as a clear pan-European problem that also requires pan-European mobilization to deal with it. Thank you for also addressing the effect that these marches have on the victimized communities, on the targeted communities. I think that's incredibly important to note. It is the obligation of states to ensure the safety and security and well-being of their citizens, and it is clear that these marches are having a negative impact, a tangible negative impact on the targeted communities. One thing that I did find particularly important to flash out is the extremely clever ways in which these organizers and the marches manage to bypass the law and to camouflage the marches as something other than what they are. Simone, you were mentioning in the beginning the anti-Semitism that is present in all of these marches, and in a way it sounds trivial. Of course, there is anti-Semitism in a march that glorifies Nazis, that glorifies Nazi collaborators. But it's important to be said because these marches are often pitched as family-friendly events, sporting events, concerts, hikes, martial arts competitions. So it's really important to reiterate that anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial are clear components at the core of these marches. one thing I would love to focus on in terms of things that have happened well, things that have been helpful, but also things that can be recommended and things that people should take note of and implement, is the civil society response. And I would love for you, Simone, to comment a little bit on best practices you've seen, you've been a part of, and what you would like to see happen moving forward on that front.
Yes, of course, sure. As we see, we need the authorities to act, but it might take some time. And in the meantime, it would be a good idea if we organize as civil societies as well to make a statement on these marches. We can see that everywhere where people do this, we saw it in the different countries in different strong reactions, and it differs also over time. Most of these marches take place for at least 20 years now. So, of course, also counter-demonstration strategies developed during this time. But we can see that where there is a counter demonstration or where there is a reaction by the cities, for example, or by civil society protesting against these marches, it has an effect on the march itself. So where there's a lot of protest, for example, we had one of these marches in Germany, for example, the Rudolf Hess march, which was a quite big one for a lot of time. But it really had a lot of counter protest also together with the city where this march was taking place. It was a city where the grave of Rudolf Hess were on the graveyard. So the neo-Nazis wanted to go there to praise Rudolf Hess. And for example, there were so many counter protests, also not only very political ones, but also fun events, trying to make this march look like a marathon, with saying we will see how many meters they can run and try to make it as few meters as we can, for example, which are all things where we can set a tone and can involve a lot of different people in society, so that everyone can take its stand. So there's, for example, sports communities were protesting against these marches and things like that. And the Rudolf Hess march nowadays is really a quite small one, because the neo-Nazis didn't have so much fun going there anymore, because the way then for a lot of years they were blocked, so they couldn't march at all, because people blocked the ways where they wanted to go. And in this case, also the family of Rudolf Hess then agreed that they really took away the grave at the very end. So he is now buried at sea, so that nobody can go there anymore, for example. There's still neo-Nazis marching to this place once a year, but these are 120 last year. Beforehand it was several thousand. So you can see that if there's a society action against these marches, it has an effect. Of course, as you see, if there's all over Europe possibilities to change just location, this is happening too, so that we can see that some of the marches who were the biggest marches in the 1990s are smaller now, and other ones have more participants now. So we need this action all over Europe, I would say, and recommend. But I think there's still a lot of things which can be done. One learning in Germany, for example, was also to include city authorities to at least, for example, make it impossible that these neo-Nazi marches are in the middle of the city center, in the nicest views you can have in a city, but could be at least banned to the outskirts of the city, where they don't have this effect of making thrilling videos or photographs how they are marching across important political buildings, for example, or across synagogues or mosques, for example. So I think this is also something people can do creatively together. For example, in Germany, the only way to do this is if there's another demonstration or event going on at the same place, but you can organize things like that. And we had very small areas for very small cities, for example, which then organized an exhibition of their tractors, saying they're all in the city center, you can't march here anymore. So I think creative civil society action is also something we can really do without bringing oneself into danger. So it's difficult. It's very important that you have different possibilities to do so. But what authorities say, and this does not only mean the city authorities, but also the museums or the churches or people which are listened to in society, this is something really important we can do ourselves.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think this idea of it needing to be a broad coalition is very important, because what we also do see oftentimes when counter demonstrators are only smaller groups, they are the ones being portrayed as the troublemakers in a sense. Of course, this is the civil society bit, but there is a lot for authorities to do, and that is also what we try to focus on most in the report. Yes, civil society is an essential voice, but we shouldn't need civil society to be the one acting. Authorities have the responsibility to do that. So one thing we focus on is the importance of implementing bans when they are in place. We cannot give the message that even if marches are deemed to be illegal, even if they are banned, we are willing to leave the streets to these fascist participants. So that is one key element to focus on. Otherwise, we are essentially weakening the legal protections against these marches. We also focused on the importance of monitoring transnational activity. This is being done to some extent, but we focused the importance of more transnational cooperation, and also specifically cooperation with Europol. We speak about the importance of, as Johanan was mentioning before, training law enforcement, training the judiciary to really be in a position to recognize and to know the legal implications of these Nazi marches, to know what constitutes and what doesn't constitute hate crime and hate speech, discrimination, Holocaust denial, and distortion. We need to see more serious action against Nazi memorabilia. And tying in with what Simone was saying, very vigilant civil society that is willing to act. As I open the stage to our two panelists, if they would like to maybe add any points, any elements that they found particularly compelling in the report that they'd like to flesh out, I'll also extend the invitation to you if there are any questions or remarks in the room. Go ahead, Johanna.
I will add one more recommendation, because the transnational element of these marches we haven't mentioned enough. You have activists in Germany, initially from banned organizations, later joining political parties that are much more difficult to be banned. You have them later speaking, for example, in Hungary and Bulgaria. You have them speaking to activists in Spain and inviting them for training in Germany. You have them talking on Telegram about going to a festival in Flanders in Belgium. So a transnational approach must include, for example, efforts to curtail the transnational effect. This is monitoring the networks, but also I think that Germany has done in certain cases implement exit bans when these extremists are known, or another thing member states can do, implement the exception of public security to not allow them to enter these marches. This is an important recommendation that I wanted to emphasize.
Thank you very much. If there aren't questions in the room, oh, I see a question in the back. Please go ahead and maybe introduce yourself. First, a microphone is over there.
Hi, my name is Sandra Kaduri, Keeping Channels Open, a new dialogue network for British, Europeans and Americans. Just wanted to see where the intersection might be with the anti-immigration movements. Is it the same people doing this? Obviously in UK, we've got issues there. Brexit was built on anti-immigration kind of narratives, but the general public don't share those feelings, by the way. But I'm wondering if, obviously there are so many of these anti-immigration movements, is it the same people behind stirring some of that feeling as the marches?
I would say, I would put it the other way around. The people who are attending the marches are also interested in anti-immigrant demonstrations and things like that. But I think these are much, in a lot of countries, that are much broader networks. So in the anti-immigration networks, you can see that not only far-right extremists or fascists are interested in hatred against migrants, but broader public. This is why this is often more successful, to put it like that. So these people attending these marches are also anti-immigrant. This is totally clear. Also through the things they are wearing on their T-shirts, for example, because in marches, as we said, they have mainly as topics really glorification of Nazism. So you can see the racism, for example, mainly on banners or what they're wearing or something like that. But these are the people who are also involved in anti-immigrant protests, but these ones are broader.
There was a question here. We'll take this one and then two more here.
Thank you. Musa Appelat from Brussels Times. Okay, you mentioned some interesting examples. And I wonder, for example, this case in Spain, Madrid, and you quoted the prosecutor. I just wonder if the case was appealed to a higher court. That's one question. Another question is, as you mentioned, I mean, many of these regular Nazi demonstrations or marches, they relate, let's say, to the glorification of war criminals during the Second World War and so on. And maybe it's also linked to places in their countries. Maybe there are streets named after them or even or statues or things like that. I mean, so as you said, if you, let's say, get rid of those reminders of those people, I mean, then perhaps there will be no incentive for them to march there, I thought. And
if we can maybe keep it with these two
what
questions.
is your idea about that? And then, of course, I mean, how do we, and that's the main question, how do we, or let's say, enforce existing legislation, both, let's say, on EU level and the national legislation? Because, as you said, I mean, in most of these countries, there seems to be a ban against such marches. Thank you.
Thank you. Johanan, you want to address that one?
Indeed, just very quickly on the Spanish case, this was what I read from was the decision from which the complaint was dismissed. It not even come to a judgment, and this was not appealed. And we do acknowledge that enforcement, and it means from all relevant implementing parts of the authorities, is a complex procedure. What we want to highlight is that the instruments are in place to put them. Very often there will be no political will. Very often the law will not have been transposed. So, for example, in the case of Bulgaria, lack of transposition of provisions of Holocaust denial would have led to a much earlier ban. So there is at different stages. It can be from the police to legislation to prosecutors. There needs to be a chain without failure for it to lead to an effective enforcement of a ban. And in each of these circumstances, a failure will be for different reasons. And this is laid out in detail in the report.
All right, we had two more questions there in the back and then in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Anton Möller. I work for the Heinrich Böll Foundation. But I have a question, which is really a personal question. Because you mentioned, I think, Simone, a lot the need for both civil society and authorities to step up in organizing counter-protests. And you mentioned a lot of authorities, churches, cities, etc. What you didn't mention, I would find quite interesting when you researched these marches, cooperation between civil society and police forces. Because my personal experience was that was a very changing moment, because the moment police forces and civil society counter-protests communicated, it was obviously impossible to frame the counter-protests as the troublemakers, right? So I would be quite interested if you have any experiences on that based on this research.
Yes, if this is possible, if it's possible to have a cooperation between civil society organizations and the police, this is a very fine thing to do, because of the reasons you mentioned, of course. I would say in the practical experiences, this does not appeal too often. That police is really open to talk to civil society organizations on eye level and are willing to listen to them too. And in some states, we have to admit that the authorities, like police, for example, or also state authorities, are part of the problem. For example, this was one thing which came on my mind while you talked as well. If you have, like in Hungary, this march is called a reenactment of an historical march. So this is why they're saying we're just playing theater, and this is why we need the costumes like SS and uniforms, for example, or showing swastikas. This makes this march, for example, so extremely appealing for German neo-Nazis who are not allowed to have these uniforms and are not allowed to show swastikas on the street for reasons. And you can, of course, not really work very well together with police who is acting out a state will, which is saying reenactment of historical Nazi marches is okay. So we always have to look at the different countries if it's possible to have this cooperation. If it's possible, of course, it's a good idea. And yes, in some places, the police feels the urge to do things and will be able to talk to civil society organizations. It's always worth a try, to put it like that.
And finally, you're in the front.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is 𝐬𝐧 𝐄𝐮𝐫𝐨𝐻. I'm the president of the European Union of Jewish Students. Thank you very much. First of all, super interesting to hear from you. I wanted to go back to the Day of Honor, the march in Hungary, where we had a few EUJS activists this year going there and really seeing firsthand what's going on, which is shocking and scary. And I was wondering if, and our observation was that it was hard to maneuver between marginalized communities that are also concerned about speaking up due to safety issues, governments that have their own problematics and their own inner forces, and then kind of like civil society organizations in general. And I'd be just curious to hear from you how to work around these sensitivities for the greater good to actually ban these marches. And if you could give us a bit of an outlook on how that might, in an utopian world, work out best case scenario.
Oh yes, I'm in the utopian world already. No, I think what is really important is to have networks of organizations who are interested in acting out against these marches. It's always difficult if you only have, for example, victimized groups who are interested in protesting against these marches. They, as you said, often have security issues even more than the normal civil society would have, for example. And if they don't have the support of other groups, it might be extremely difficult, and people do this one time and they will not be doing it again. So this is, of course, also a problem. So I think networking is extremely important beforehand, to try to build up networks who organize protests together. You can see this in smaller places where it's sometimes easier to organize things like that. If you get really a coalition of every people living in this part of the city where these marches take place, for example, and they agree on democratic values, they want to state out and do this not only in a counter protest, but for example, hang up banners on the streets so that they can't march anywhere without having a commentary from the civil society, from the people who have their little shops there, from the bibliothèque or something like that. This is, I think, very important, and it also strengthens the victimized groups if they want to go on protests, if they have also a civil society protection. That people are aware, for example, that there is a synagogue on the march route, and that it needs perhaps a special protection by more people in front of the building or things like that. And as you said, in the utopian world where we have banned all this, you know that this is not the end of far-right extremism or anti-Semitism, and that will also not be the end of unorganized far-right scene in Europe. but at least it would be a lot more difficult to organize themselves, especially if we combine it, for example, with travel bans or things like that. If these are known far-right extras who travel to organize, for example, crimes or violence, it might be possible to do so as well. Of course, they can still organize online. That's one thing I know for sure. But they don't have these moments of support and fun together on the streets, which I think is very important to keep this scene vivid and alive. And so it's very good to disturb them wherever we can. And if these bans would be applied, of course, there would be still, I guess there would be still demonstrations here and there, but not such big ones, not the ones which are giving them a feeling of power in Europe, which they don't have, and we will never let them have again. Want to
Great.
add something?
That was a perfect conclusion.
Yeah. Well, I think your question speaks very much also to the spirit in which we put out this report. As we said, we're seeing a pan-European problem. We must view these marches as a pan-European problem, and we want to see a pan-European solution emerge. Part of that are these pan-European coalitions, activists who want to see a stop to these marches, organizations that want to put a stop to these marches, coming together, working together, traveling together to these places, documenting, experiencing all the illegal and violent behaviors that are seen there, and being able to tell those stories coming back home. I think it would be very exciting to see those coalitions emerging and also very effective. Thank you so much for joining us to discuss on the margins of our new report. We really encourage everyone here and everyone joining us online to proactively engage with it, to think about actions, activities, follow-up that might be relevant, that might be constructive. Don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. In the meantime, we're very grateful that you were here in this first moment of engagement. We're very happy to have these report out. You can already find it on the websites of both B'nai B'rith and the Amadeu Antonio Stiftung. Thank you so much for having joined us today.